student workers' protest that gained international attention and sparked student movements in various parts of the African continent, but also the Caribbean, Europe, and Turtle Island. These protests were not only about toppling monuments or changing curricula, but about building resistential power together with workers and against neoliberalization of the university and the economic system towards more social and liberatory ways of knowing, being, and modes of production. We are grateful that Tari Ajadi and Yasmine Djerbal have agreed to be in conversation with Brian, Moshibudi, and Hibist. So let me introduce them all to you. Moshibudi Motimele is a theorist, researcher, teacher, and writer, currently completing a doctoral degree at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Her work centers on questions of Black intellectual histories, critical pedagogies, and emancipatory epistemologies. She is co-editor of the Agenda special issue on the intimacies of pandemics, and her forthcoming co-edited book is titled Wandering Hands and Spirited Ink, Snapshots into the Black Public Humanities. She currently works as a lecturer in the Department of Political Studies and Governance at the University of the Free State. Then we have Dr. Hibist Kassa on the panel, who is a fellow of the Center for African Studies and attached to the chair of Land Reform and Democracy in South Africa at the University of Cape Town. Hibist has spent 14 years developing an understanding of African political economy from the vantage point of within the feminist movement in Ghana and later globally. She was a member of the Executive Committee of Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, and she was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. Brian Kamanzi is an energy policy research associate with the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy at the City University of New York and a research consultant with Institute for Economic Justice in Johannesburg. Brian has been working to provide technical policy support for sections of the South African trade union movement around a just energy transition. He holds a master in electrical engineering and has worked in the wind energy sector in the operations and maintenance environment, public advocacy campaigns, and community radio. Brian also participated in the student worker uprisings in South Africa, where he became involved in a number of popular education formations. Brian regularly pushes political commentary on a variety of local and international platforms on rising relating issues around climate change, Pan-Africanisms, free education, among other issues. Tari Ajadi is a PhD candidate in political science at Dalhousie University and a pre-doctoral fellow here in Black Studies at Queen's University. His dissertation research compares how Black activists in Halifax, Nova Scotia, strategize to prompt change in policing and in health policy. In 2023, Tari will begin as an assistant professor in Black politics and Department of Political Science at McGill University. Congrats again, Tari, and he holds an MA in Political Science from Dalhousie University. Last but not least, our wonderful facilitator that will actually facilitate this conversation and is always such an inspiring person and colleague to be in conversation with is Dr. Yasmine Djerbal, who's an educational developer in anti-racist pedagogies and inclusion at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Queen's University. In her position, she supports with design and implementation of the university-wide strategic plan for inclusive teaching and collaborates with Queen's teaching communities to create anti-racist and inclusive curricula, content, and learning environments. Yasmine holds an MA in Gender Studies and a PhD in Cultural Studies from Queen's University. She remains involved in research and teaching, where her interests lie in critical race studies, immigration, citizenship law, gender, and Islamophobia. Yasmine is also a community organizer committed to social justice and social change. Thank you, everyone. And yes, Yasmine, I'll pass the word to you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, and thank you all for being here today. And thank you also for our panelists for joining us for this conversation after already having done a workshop earlier this morning. So I hope that your energy levels are up and that we can continue the conversation. And as we think about Black student movements together and this struggles both in South Africa and in Canada, I was hoping that maybe, Brian, you could help us set this stage for what happened with the Rhodes Must Fall campaign and the 2015-2016 student workers protests in South Africa. And so really think with us about who Cecil Rhodes was, what he represented for South Africa and in South African history.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Vanessa for reaching out to us, and greetings to all my fellow panelists and guests. Just going to confirm, can everyone hear me? See my computer screen? Great. Okay, so I'm just going to have some pictures to have in the background. Can everyone still see my screen? I can no longer see you, so.
Yeah, we can hear you and see your screen.
Okay, all right, fantastic. So to start off with, how did we get here? Right, so this picture was taken on the 9th of March. The activist's name is Kamanzi Makwele, and he threw essentially what you're seeing there is the bottom part of what people call a porta potty in other parts of the world. That was taken from an informal settlement about 20 minutes away from the University of Cape Town. And the excrement was thrown on the base of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, which created an outcry. How did we get to the point where this was taken? So 2015, almost 20 years after the turn of democracy in South Africa, there is a sense where there's a narrative that has been advanced of South Africa, the rainbow nation, post-racial society, a poster child for the success of liberal democracy, so-called one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. What does it really mean? What has it really meant for people? The strikes that happened in 2016 and 15 are really a subsection of a subsection. South Africa has been protesting for over 400 years. There've been a continuous, unbroken line of protests against the oppressive, various and evolving oppressive structures in the country, and that continued post-democracy. The student protests were an iteration of that. What was an important inflection about that had made these protests interesting, I think, there was a blend between actions that were happening at historically white universities, tended to be more elite, and historically Black universities, protests happening across both. They were linked, but also introducing language like decolonization in a way that was raising interesting questions for this new social compact that we call South Africa. And the fact that this action, described by the liberal establishment as being very grotesque, is a very important break and a disjuncture at that moment. University of Cape Town identifies itself as being a liberal institution, priding itself on things like free speech and open debate. All of that meant nothing to many Black students who had been integrated into the university, but still felt excluded, both at a social level, at an institutional level in terms of funding, and absolutely a level in terms of curriculum and content. Many students felt that there was no African literature, let alone content with ideas, thinkers from Latin America, Asia, parts of the Middle East, and so on. So there was growing discontent. Many student activists, there had been many iterations of student activism before this movement. Kamanzi's action generated a lot of outcry, including from the student body. And actually what this fomented was a lot of support within this Black student organizing to kind of come together and rally around the discussions that were happening around exclusion. So it became about, you find this so disgusting, but you don't find the state of our society disgusting, and the role that this institution plays in producing an unequal and unfair society. So that moment, it led to a discussion around the removal of the statue. But actually, in the demands that were generated by this coalition of activists and organizers, there were 21 demands. Curriculum was front and center in those demands. Issues around funding was listed. Issues around the treatment and payment of workers on campus, cleaning staff on campus was listed there. This culminated in the demands were handed over. They were not adequately responded to. In fact, the last count I had, over 15 of the 21 have just was summarily dismissed. But this led to an occupation. So the admin building was captured by a student coalition and was renamed Azania House in the spirit of the Black consciousness tradition, Azania being an alternative name for the territory known as South Africa, coming from the Black consciousness movement of the 1970s. Now, in that space, in Azania House, was a very interesting space. One of the ethoses of the occupation was non-hierarchicalness. And so all the decisions were intended to be made in plenaries. Activities and actions were determined and proposed by subcommittees that were empowered through a plenary process. And all major decisions were meant to be done by consultation. As anyone who's ever been involved in a process like that, you know, one, it takes a lot of time, and two, there's a lot of contradictions. While the ethos might be that everyone's voice matters, not everyone's suggestion carries the same weight for a whole host of reasons. So we had to contend with that, and had to contend with some of the issues around that. It became an engine, the occupations became an engine for protest across campus. A lot of, while the protests were starting to get a lot of media attention, the university tried to hold parallel processes of dialogue, so-called dialogue, to dismiss the call to remove the statue, and also to singularly focus the attention of the protests around the statue. And so protests intervened at every opportunity of these dialogues to try and raise broader questions and also speak back to society. We're always speaking back to society. Here's an example of one of those meetings. Public art was very important. It's a comrade of mine, Ernie Coelho, was a part of Rhodes Must Fall. Cape Town is a slave city. It's not often spoken of and thought of in this way. Bringing slavery into the conversation is important. It's important also because this wave was questioning the ways in which South Africa is thought about, because that has bearings on how people think about its future. So when I mentioned what makes it interesting is talking about decolonization, is that when people think about the post-apartheid era, we often don't speak about liberation in South Africa as being tied to the longer, deeper process of colonization. And so when we're saying we want decolonization, we're saying that there's unfinished business, you know, so to speak, bones buried in the backyard. Sorry. Here's an example of what I meant, the circle. Circle was very important, whether it was protest addressing student masses, which on popular days could be thousands. On days after we were, you know, disciplined by the media or called violent or other kinds of things, it could be 5 people, right? The moment of the removal of the statue came about a month afterwards. And actually, in my opinion, perhaps controversially so, the removal of the statue was almost a moment of defeat to some extent. By the time that the university decides to remove the statue, they, in a sense, successfully isolate the movement from the popular student base and attempt to singularize the issue as the being about the statue, and say that liberal dialogue has come to the conclusion that the statue must be removed. Meanwhile, you know, in the space, in the plenaries, we were inviting academics from all over, activists from all over the city. We're having conversations about this dream deferred that is not delivered, about a new, free South Africa, right? And so the protests continue. After that, they were evacuated by force from the main administrative building. A housing building was occupied, actually parallel to a street named after Rhodes himself, on the mountain. And it was called Azania 2. And there were every time we occupied, it increased in numerical numbers, Azania 3, 4. In this one, the terms of that, the new Azania were being negotiated with the government, but also at the same time, there were issues around, we're pivoting towards supporting the worker issues more fervently, because many of us were feeling that, you know, we want a symbolic victory, but it feels very hollow, because what we've meant has meant a lot. We had workers participating in some of our sessions, many of the students actually, and as I kind of quickly wrap up and hand over, many of the students involved, actually the tipping point of this moment is that once a previously very exclusionary institution had a critical mass of students, Black students, both from a middle-class background, maybe parents were professionals, teachers, policemen, and so on, civil society, children of civil society, and also students coming from the townships, township schools. And those together created a critical mass of students who were facing particular kinds of differentiated exclusion, but that drove the momentum to have this kind of protest, have this kind of action, and push through. Some of that space was also held open by departments like this, Black Studies departments. In our case, it was Gender Studies and African Studies. Here, Zetu Matobeni, she came from Gender Studies. She was in a different department this time, leading a session. And this shows, not most of the people in this room have never been in a Gender Studies classroom, but we all knew who she was, and we all came to listen to what she had to say. She was giving us a lecture. People came and participated in an open forum. Anyone was allowed to attend. And so we were creating our parallel institutions, which we hope would represent the new kind of university, right? I'll leave some of talking about some of the solidarity campaigns for later. Here's a picture. Here I am. I had a much better hairdo at that point in time. Often had solidarity calls with organizations from other parts of the world. Here we were talking to a group from another part of the country, Black Student Movement, and trying to share and understand what they're going through, and also to improve what we were doing as well. So we've charted the journey from around March till September. By September, we decide it's time to strike for workers, and then by now we're really engaging in a national conversation with other students, and at this point I'll hand over, I think, to Hibist, who can share what happens next.
Thank you. But actually, before we do that,
Sorry.
thank you for contextualizing the movement for us and all of the work that led to this moment in 2015, 2016. And to me, there is a lot of resonance, especially in thinking about what Trish Salah here in gender studies has termed the institutional recuperation of this language of decolonization and what it means in the context of the university. But I was also, and you started talking also about what made this particular moment and this movement so distinct. Moshibudi, I was hoping that you could also talk to us, in your opinion, about what made this moment also distinct from other student organizing campaigns in South Africa, and what kinds of movements have emerged from the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, both locally and perhaps transnationally, at the University of Stellenbosch, at Rhodes, Pretoria, and later also in the UK and the United States as well.
Thanks for that, Yasmine, and thanks to Brian for laying that foundation as well. I think one of the things I should say from the beginning, just following from Brian, is that in as much as we speak about a student movement, the sort of prioritization of issues and the way they emerge is really unique to the different universities. And so that's important to keep in mind as well. So Rhodes Must Fall is one iteration that begins at GCT. But I think importantly to what Brian is saying, it maps onto firstly a long trajectory of student protest and student worker protest prior, but also different sort of prioritizations within those protests and movements as they move across the universities. So one of the things that really struck me in one of the images that Brian showed of the statue was that little placard at the bottom about white arrogance. And I think that's also really important to preface, because the University of Wits, where I was as well, is also sort of liberal university, and they have that type of arrogance coming from apartheid of having been open universities. So they weren't as bad as the sort of racist universities. They have this denialism around the type of institutional culture marked by whiteness, the racism, etc. Right? So there's this idea that even that throwing on the feces is not only disrupting the narrative of the rainbow, but also disrupting this narrative of these liberal white universities that are really in denial, not only about their complicity through apartheid and like colonialism, but even now in being these spaces that are really violent in important ways to Black students and staff. So that was 9th of March. So just to go back a little bit, at WITS, there is 2014 and prior, all these conversations already happening around not yet decolonization then, but the failed transformation of the university in these spaces. So big issues around curricula, the lack of Black academic staff, etc. And so the moment happens on the 9th of March in Cape Town, and at WITS in April the next month, we have a meeting under this banner of Transform WITS, saying, well, how do we feed into, with all the issues that have been present, that people have been speaking around, this UCT moment, and what are some of the ways we can map our demands onto it as well. And then I just printed out the manifesto that came out of that, and it was really interesting to read it now, like Brian was saying, and just to see how we really haven't come far at all on any of these things. So there were 6 demands, but before then, there were 2 comments made, one about the non-partisan nature of the movement. And I think that's really important. I mean, all the parts of the student formations, people have partisan memberships, they have different sort of politics that they're a part of, but to say when you come into the student movement space, you enter as a student, as an individual, and you leave that partisan politics at the door, which was important. And the second was a comment on respectability politics and the policing of modes of protest. Because of course, there's all this rhetoric about violent students, you know, with rocks and not violent police and securitization, but also this respectability politics. So you don't throw feces. It's something that's just so crude and disgusting and, you know, improper. And you don't just stand up and shout and speak back. And there's all this policing of modes of protest and what's acceptable. So just saying that that's not going to be what this movement is a part of. So those 6 pillars that emerged, and this is even before Rhodes Must Fall, the first was on the Africanization of university symbolism and institutional memory. And I think Brian has spoken to that quite a bit. The second was on the radical revision and Africanization of all university curricula. And this again, a sustained issue that's come up across. The third was a fast tracking of the Africanization of academic staff contingency, and just around the fact that you still have this predominantly white male staff contingent across disciplines in our universities. The fourth pillar was an end to worker discrimination. And again, this issue of outsourcing, one that's been happening. I mean, in 1994 at WITS, there's a big protest where people like Walter Sisulu and Cheryl Carolus have to come to the university and intervene around issues of worker struggles and outsourcing. So this is a sustained issue. The fifth pillar was an end to financial exclusion of students. And this is what really takes primacy, and we spoke about earlier in the workshop, why it was easier to latch onto fees as something that can be responded to, and not as easy to talk about issues of institutional culture, institutional memory, continued racism, etc. And the last was on the revision of departmental academic structures that impede the throughput of Black students. And I think a sort of structural critique about the ways universities are set up and the bureaucracy of it, in terms of senates and councils, also becomes a really big issue at WITS. It's outside of student issues. What are sort of the structural formations that insist on the continuation of these types of things? And how do we sort of decolonize and transform those as well? So I think by the time the student fee increment is announced and that becomes the mass protest that people call Fees Must Fall, really what that fees represents is like this coalescing of all these different issues at a moment that there's mass mobilization behind. So a lot of people understood that moment not just to be about the commodification of education or the neoliberalization of the university, but how the conditions of possibility for all these things were based on these different pillars that we identified, so that you can't isolate a single issue, right? Which is why when the president announces the 0% fee increment at the end of the protest, the issues continue, because that hasn't dealt with the depth of the issues that students were really trying to bring out and talk to. So I think that's important as well. And we don't have a statue of Rhodes at our university, but just in terms of the symbolism, and Brian is speaking about how the space became a Zanya house at UCT, and at WITS, the space of occupation, students named Solomon Mahlangu House. And then Solomon Mahlangu was a young ANC member who trained as part of the armed wing Umkhonto weSizwe in Angola, Mozambique, etc., and who was actually killed by the apartheid police at like the really young age of 23. So I think in him a different type of symbolism, not that far taken away from Azania House, but of a young Black activist who stood up for himself, but was killed by police as well. So yeah, there's very ways in which issues travel similarly. And I think it's interesting how the different prioritizations of what must fall at any particular time, whether it's patriarchy or misogyny or fees, or sort of the symbolism of Rhodes, etc., led to these spaces where we could do deeper readings and conversations and bring people in to understand, well, what are the conditions for the possibility of all these issues? So what exactly does our activism have to be based on in our engagement with the university? Because they can just say no fee increment and be like, now go back to school, we've dealt with your issue. You know, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to turn it to you, Hibist, to kind of, help us understand these connections between the labor movement of, precarious university staff and the student fees, and how we can connect these movements to the decolonization of the university, but also kind of like thinking about the interlocking systems of colonialism and the neoliberalization of the university and privatization and state power, and how they all kind of like were brought together by the student movement.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think that the context that a lot of this came together was around the October 6th movement. And the October 6th movement was significant to the extent that it really started off as just a space for progressive or concerned academics from the university, from true universities, University of Witwatersrand and University of Johannesburg, to come together alongside students and alongside worker representatives just to discuss just the implications of what had happened in Rhodes Must Fall. Because really that moment of protest and mobilization early on had left had opened up a rapture. It was a moment of rapture that there was mutual recognition about. And so we initially started forming these working groups, various of them largely dealing with things to do with the curriculum and, just trying to understand what this decolonization actually means. And, but once we were really, once the worker issue in particular was building up as a central issue, it began to overshadow all of these questions because it had immediate material issues that needed to be responded to, in addition to what students were also pressing for, the immediate conditions of life that needed to be improved and responses around, and the fees issue kind of grounded that conversation. So taking it away from more abstract discussions, so people more comfortable, to a space of, if you will, a greater degree of solidarity and what that solidarity can look like. And ultimately, there was a particular pronouncement made by Noor Niftagodin, who's a well-known progressive scholar. And in a meeting, he declared that we have to organize a meeting, we have to organize simultaneous activities across all the universities, and this event is going to be historic in nature. And as an individual, he really made a declaration, which at the time didn't seem like much. We just thought, okay, we'll have simultaneous actions, big deal. We'll do it, but yeah, it will be noteworthy somewhere, footnote in history, but no real understanding about the momentum that was actually building around us and how this could rupture. So it was, we were overwhelmed when we actually saw the scale of mobilization and the connections that people were drawing to this. But I must remember that there was also other structures that had been organizing against the insourcing, and that can be traced to early as 1999, as Shibu was referring to, 1994 protests around this whole privatization, precaritization of the workforce within the university space, and resistance to that. And so there had been ongoing spaces. People had been working for over a decade, building those spaces, worker spaces. And there was solidarity also in some platforms. But in my university, there was very little expression at the University of Johannesburg. And I suspect it's because of how strong the party structures were. And they didn't really encourage that kind of solidarity building on a day-to-day basis, because we never students actually involved. It was mainly international students who tended to provide solidarity. And that's what workers would tell me. So there were variations across the board in terms of how much engagement and relationship building and understanding of the worker struggle that had been built up. But all of these spaces had been building over a long period of time and going through their experiences of resistance, people being thrown out of work, and with the private companies essentially bullying a lot of workers. So victimization was always an issue that was brought forward. And in the midst of a moment when there was a beginning of, especially after the 0% moment, where the president announced that there would not be any increase in the fees, in spaces where the organizing hadn't built those collectives and space for debate and deepening those discussions, they withered away very quickly. And so that context within which the University of Johannesburg found itself, where it withered away very quickly, and then we just held on to the worker struggle. It became the strategy to keep the momentum going and to continue to build a language between workers and students, to an extent that by the time we ended up having direct negotiations with our vice chancellor at the time was a former fighter of the Umkhonto weSizwe. So he is someone very much embedded within the ANC structures. And when we were beginning to confront him, he was meeting students who were speaking worker issues, workers who were speaking to student issues. For instance, I can share this quick slide, which will show you an image of workers on the right holding a poster. Our parents deserve better, not yet Uhuru. And those are workers from precarious workers who are raising these issues. So it was very much a moment when we had built, if you will, a solid space of organizing. But and there was essentially a 3-week strike that workers were able to maintain and hold in solidarity with students to hold space and to be able to sustain organizations. Particular case in the university, the structure fell apart. And if you are really understand worker issues, if we talk about representatives, representatives for the trade unions, the contradictions that already existed between trade unions and representing these precarious workers, largely women, essentially sharpened to an extent that the very organization that we built over a decade just fell apart. And new unions also came into space. So we had new forms of organizations that came in the midst of this moment that began to grow. So you have the University and Allied Workers Union in GCT, the Southern African Liberated Public Sector Union that was growing, but other organizations also grew. The Economic Freedom Fighters, which we can regard as one of the main political parties in South Africa, and the Pan-Africanist Student Movement of Azania. And there was also a new formation of the Academic and Professional Staff Association of South Africa. What we were probably lacking was beginning to build those relationships between actually getting academics to unionize also and recognize themselves as workers, to begin to build this pushback against the neoliberal higher institutions. So it's not just a question of you are here in solidarity with the precarious workers to get them insourced, but not having your own issues to also put on the table to transform that, or to get postdocs and other forms, research assistants, all the other layers of, if you will, petty bourgeois, if you will, layers of the class, to also identify as workers and centralize their own issues, and then also see that as part of the decolonization of the university. Material questions that have to be linked to broader questions, because those broader questions were always there. They are racialized stuff. Their racialized, class, gendered stuff. And therefore, all these dynamics were coming together. So the interlocking nature of the experience was there. The idea that there was a second-class citizen within the layer of second-class citizens within the university space that had been structured. The fact that there was an accountability crisis and a governance crisis of the university itself, how the university could project itself as a space for freedom of association and expression and living when you had second-class within the space. So the interlocking experience of it was there, and there were expressions about intersectionality. but the intersectionality that found expression hardly connected with those direct experiences. So the interlocking traditions didn't link up strongly as they should have, both to be able to build organization of space for reflection, but also connecting them to those material spaces. But no organizing or development of ideology happens in a neat process. And also because of the nature of the movements that we had and the problems we had with building relationship with the community, because that's where you have the interlocking experiences also coming in strongly, that you can then connect with the theories of intersectionality that people were exploring and engaging with, which are fantastic. But there were also divergences on terms of what kind of the ways in which people personalized it and reduced it to the self, without connecting it to the broader experiences of others. So in terms of solidarity and empathy building was very weak. Towards the end, it became the downfall of the movement itself and its inability to revive and rebuild itself moving forward. So and in terms of the Maracana moment, it's also important to remember that the Maracana moment was significant in shaping how workers were always understanding and analyzing their situation. So when we used to have, prior to the student movement, when we used to have committee meetings of the workers' committee meetings, they would always ask questions about what the situation was of Maracana workers. Do we know? Mainly because some of the members, which part of the academics, were doing research on Maracana. So they knew they could talk to them about these things, and they were always trying to understand what's going on, how things progressing, how, they were very concerned and very conscious of the demands that were being made by mine workers who had been slaughtered in Rustenburg, but the strike that continued in spite of that, and the inspiration that they were getting from that, and the need to be able to push, and the sense of being part of a broader working class. You could see that reflection coming through constantly. And so, in many ways also, it's important to reflect back a bit and consider that the history of the creation of the migrant labor system and how that also structured to create a racialized but also gendered Black labor. The ways that production was located within those. Sorry, am I talking too much?
No, I'm not, absolutely not. We just have another question for Tari before we open it up to the audience to see if they have questions, and maybe you can continue with that thought. I apologize, Hibist, about that. It's not you, it's time. And I often say in my workshops, we are colonized by time, yet in another way. But so much of what you all have been saying really connects to so much of the activism and the student activism that I have also seen here in Canada. I myself came here as an international student from Algeria, and there were incredible movements, right, around lowering the fees for international students. And some of the activism that has come up here at Queen's in particular has been around these issues. But we were never quite able to kind of connect to those larger systems and create the dots in the ways that you have been. And I'm finding this so inspiring. And Tari, I wanted to turn the mic to you and ask you about, the contexts of your own experience here in Canada. And there has been, and we have seen many of similar movements here to topple down statues, including in what was previously known as Ryerson University, but also in cities, right? Here in Kingston with the Sir John A. Macdonald statue and the Queen Victoria statue in Winnipeg, etc. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the significance of these movements and what they've represented in the context of the university and the activism of Black and Indigenous students in these movements to decolonize and disrupt the curriculum.
Thanks so much, Yasmine. Thanks so much for the panelists, because I think you've really revealed and helped to kind of situate my own understanding, not just in this discussion, but broadly speaking. So I'll kind of take you through a little bit of a journey of the ways that I've been able to conceptualize of myself as both formerly an international student in Canada, as a Pan-Africanist, and at the same time, living in this space in Turtle Island and beginning to understand, the construction of the mythology here that has a really profound impact on the ways that, fundamentally the state functions in Canada. It's something that's quite profound, right? And so when we're thinking about the ways that movements to tear down statues, but to tear down statues amongst many other kinds of outcomes and trajectories. When we're thinking about these movements, what we're doing is we're reconstituting and remaking public space to continually expose the horror and theft at the root of this country's foundation and present functioning, and the roles oftentimes that universities in particular play in this ongoing violence, both in terms of the ways that they currently shape our cities and communities, and the ways that they help to create and construct that mythology, have historically done so and do so contemporaneously. And so I really kind of see these themes working in conversation and aligning over this period of time. And I think that, you know, sitting here in 2022 and as part of these conversations, it's easy to forget how dominant these facile views of Canada's history have been until Black and Indigenous protesters across the country, and many of them as students, expose and continually expose these lies for what they are, right? And it's so profound for me because moving here, I initially understood Canada to be the place it was sold to be, right? Like it's these taken for granted assumptions about Canada the good, Canada the peacemaker, without interrogation of not only our history, but our ongoing destruction and colonial plunder, both here in Turtle Island and, of course, further afield, including on the African continent via Canadian mining companies. And these myths inform our curricula at our universities and inform the ways that the state at all three levels, at the municipal level, the provincial level, and at the federal government level, and non-state actors extract resources and also shape the means of production. So for me, I moved here in 2011, and the first kind of disruption, the first kind of way that I began to understand Canada as being this very harmful and very difficult place to navigate was through the I Don't Know More movement, right, in 2012. And it's a movement by Indigenous activists to essentially expose the continuing and ongoing colonial plunder at the root of Canada's resource extraction programs and processes, right? And so this begins to disrupt this dialogue of reconciliation that underwrites a lot of what Canada has presently been going through, and certainly over the past, I would say 6 or 7 years, 2022, 7 years, 2015, right, since Justin Trudeau was elected in Canada. Sorry, my math always kind of gets me a little bit. But these movements are this opening and an entry point to a profoundly different relationship with each other, right? Like the organizers themselves are asking us to open up a space where we can relate differently with each other. So particularly Black and Indigenous students are starting to really write into our contemporary understandings, the ways that our histories are interconnected, right? In ways that, you know, when I first came to Canada, this was not a discussion that was previously being had. And I think that students have really helped to emphasize and to articulate those connections in ways that previously I hadn't understood or experienced. And so in this continuity, there's also change. And I think that change is inspired very much by the Rhodes Must Fall movement, about that kind of refusal and the radical refusal that was at the root of actions at now Toronto Metropolitan University, but also in spaces like Halifax. So in Halifax is the city I know best in Canada. And in 2017, there was significant protests and movements towards tearing down a statue of Edward Cornwallis, who was a figure, a British colonial figure who called for the scalps of Mi'kmaq community members in, I believe, 1752. And so his statue sat right at the heart of the city. And this was a site of organizing. This was a site of contest. And I experienced firsthand how the momentum from those particular actions helped to shape not only future actions, but also a dispensation. A kind of attitude of refusal and an attitude of solidarity that wasn't previously there. It didn't previously kind of shape the way that we thought about ourselves. But at the same time, we have to be careful not to be distracted by, you know, some of the important but also limited gains that we've made, right? I'm thinking about the ways that the movements in South Africa help to connect worker struggles with the student movement. And here we're not doing that in the ways that we need to be, right? So I'm thinking about right now at my alma mater of sorts, Dalhousie University, there are QP workers, adjunct workers who are currently on strike, protesting just the exploitation over decades of their labor, right? And many of these people are international students, and all of these struggles are interconnected, but they're not necessarily being articulated in these ways. In Ontario, tomorrow, in fact, there are the QP union is striking, because the provincial government is using the most heavy-handed tool that they have in their possession, I think called the notwithstanding clause, which essentially allows them to impose laws regardless of our Bill of Rights, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? Like they are using this clause to foreclose individual rights and prevent people from going on strike, right? And so these people, these struggles are interconnected, right? Like tomorrow I'm teaching, and ironically I'm teaching about labor rights and labor rights as they connect to Black politics. And I think part of what I'm going to do with my students is probably, if they're willing, take them to the picket line. Because fundamentally, I don't see a way that we can, that I can sit here and talk about the gains that we've made without fully articulating and understanding what is at risk right now, right? We're in a moment of disruption. We're in a moment of rupture, and we need to, following your lead, and help to connect these dots and articulate this for students so that they can understand and be part of these movements as well. And so I'll finish my comments there because I know that we're short on time, but I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you so much, Tari. And now maybe we can stop recording, and then we will open it up to the rest of the folks who are here with us today